This week, Josh Bressers from Anchor and the Open Source Security Podcast is with us to play Whose Vulnerability Is It Anyway? And also discuss how we can better track and score vulnerabilities. Next up in the security news, take on the upstream. How hard is it to patch end-of-life software? Hacks millions of routers. Take over millions of routers. And those are two separate stories. 0 days and no response. Hack Taylor Swift wristbands. Can you detect that covert channel? Breach reports from Ticketmaster, Snowflake, Santander, and TikTok. And top it all off with a C-level DNS server just dropping off the internet. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. It's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly.
BreachLock is a global leader in continuous attack surface discovery and penetration testing. Since BreachLock was founded, they are adding over 50 new customers every month. They have discovered over 1 million reported vulnerabilities and performed more than 20,000 pen testing engagements, including pen tests for over 15,000 web applications, 8,000 mobile apps, more than 100,000 APIs, over 10,000 cloud security audits, and over 200,000 network endpoints. They test your entire attack surface and help you mitigate your next cyber breach before it occurs. Know your risk. Contact BreachLock today. Visit securityweekly.com/BreachLock. Coming to you from Purgatory Studios in semi-high definition compliments of Darth Vader himself, this is Paul's Security Weekly, episode number 831, being recorded on Wednesday, June 5th, 2024. I'm, of course, your host, Paul Asadorian. I'm joined by Mr. Jeff Mann. Jeff, welcome.
Hey, Paul, it's good to be back. I feel like I haven't been on the show in months.
Yeah, it's been a hot minute. Yeah, it's good to have you.
I've been on the road for the last 2 months. That's probably why. I was all ready to do it last week, and then we didn't have a show.
I know. But we're here this week with Mandy Logan. Mandy, welcome.
Good evening. How's everybody doing?
Hey, we're doing great. Well, at least I'm doing great. I won't speak for anyone else. Maybe Josh Marpet is doing crappy. Who knows?
Hopefully I'm doing fantastic.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that. Josh Marpet is also here with us. Josh,
I'm here with another Josh and Paul and Jeff and Mandy. Like, come on, it's amazing.
Before we get to that, a couple of quick announcements. Dive into cybersecurity with Cyber Risk Alliance for exclusive insights from the RSA Conference 2024. Explore executive interviews with industry leaders uncovering visionary perspectives on threats and strategies. Delve into curated articles on trends and innovations, equipping yourself with essential knowledge for today's cyber landscape. Visit securityweekly.com/RSAC for expert guidance and inspiration in navigating cybersecurity challenges confidently, and also how to write announcements using ChatGPT. The Stogie Geeks show is back after a long break. We have restarted the show, so please go back to your podcast catchers and subscribe to hear myself, Jim McMurray, Joe Hozempa, Jason Albuquerque, and more, and others talk about cigars, whiskey, and random nerd stuff. It's kind of the way the show is structured. So cigars first, then whiskey, then random nerd stuff is how it's broken out. You can visit stogiegeeks.com to subscribe. Check out our previous episodes and the live stream every other Friday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Today we're talking about and playing the game, whose vulnerability is it anyway? Mr. Josh Bressers is here with us. He's the Vice President of Security from Anchor. Josh has helped build and manage product security teams for open source projects as well as several organizations. Everything from managing dependencies, vulnerabilities, security development lifecycle, DevSecOps and security product management, security strategy, and nearly any other task that falls under the security umbrella. Josh is your man. Josh co-hosts the Open Source Security Podcast and the Hacker History Podcast, two of my favorite podcasts.
Awesome.
I'm so thankful to be friends with Josh. I hope he considers me. I consider you a friend. He is also the co-founder of the Global Security Database Project to bring vulnerability identification into the modern age. Welcome, my friend, Josh Bressers.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. It's quite the intro. I don't know if I can live up to that one. But and I will say for everyone, so Paul was just a guest on the Hacker History Podcast, so we get to hear all about Paul's nerdy background, and it's really fun and it's really good.
Is that because Paul is that old?
Yes. Yes.
Hey, look, I don't
That's why the
pretend I'm
history
young
comes
either.
in.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's right. Exactly. Exactly. It's part of the fun. Like all us geezers, we got stories to tell. Like we've seen some stuff.
You know, they had computers back then.
Barely.
Well, you'll notice that Jeff is sitting in his ancestral house where no computers are.
Mm-hmm.
I've got my abacus fired up and ready to go.
Nice.
I know the production was like, "Can you adjust the lights?" I'm like, "Jeff's in his cabin. He can light some more candles." That's like that's the extent of it.
Yep, I got four.
When he says the wireless, he means the radio from like 1930.
Right. Right.
Hang on, I'll get the shortwave.
So, Josh,
yes,
it's it's interesting.
That's not going to get old, is it?
I know, right?
No, it's really not. I'm sorry.
I'll refer to you as Quadling for the remainder of
work.
this
That's
segment.
valid. I answer to it. It's okay.
So when I say Josh, I mean Bressers. It's
fine.
Really, I mean, there's a long history behind vulnerability tracking and scoring, but I feel like in the past year that you and Kurt were talking about it on the show.
Yep.
I was covering stories on this show. I'm going, there's like something like there's a disturbance in the force essentially with respects to vulnerability tracking, even disclosure, CVE and CVSS. I'm like, something's not right. And then week after week, I was observing different things. So much so that I gave a talk at B-Sides Charm all about what I had been, observing. And then hearing you guys were basically like backing up everything I was thinking about and talking in my talk.
Awesome.
But you have, I believe, a unique perspective on this. But Kurt was the one that was on the board for CVE at Mitre. Right. But you have a deep background in this as well. So, Josh, I guess start by talking about your experiences with vulnerability tracking like CVE and kind of how it all started from your perspective.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So I worked at Red Hat for about a dozen years. I started there in 2004. And I was part of the team that did all of the vulnerabilities and all of the Red Hat stuff. Well, Red Hat stuff was basically Red Hat Linux back in those days. I mean, it's nothing like it is today. But we were the group responsible for figuring out, like, is this thing a vulnerability? And then assigning it a CVE ID. We would do coordination across open source. I mean, there was this mailing list called VendorSec way back in the day. It got horribly pwned at one point, which is why it died. Like no one knows who pwned it, but all the messages were going somewhere they shouldn't have been for we don't know how long. But anyway, I did all this work with vulnerabilities. There was one point in my career at Red Hat where I was literally the person assigning all of the open source CVEs for a couple of years.
Because I mean, a vulnerability in Red, but a vulnerability in Red Hat. A vulnerability in Red Hat, Josh, is a vulnerability in some open source tool, utility, project, or software, right? It's not, I mean, it could be specific to the distribution, but it really means if curl has a vulnerability and Red Hat incorporates curl, it means Red Hat has the vulnerability, but the vulnerability is in curl.
Exactly. And so you can imagine Red Hat had a lot of interest in playing nicely in the community. Mm-hmm. And so we did a ton of work with open source projects. We would coordinate vulnerabilities with them. We would, write descriptions. We kind of whatever needed to be done, we would go and do it because we understood there was value in CVE IDs and having, just a coherent way to talk about this stuff. Because I mean, not that everyone remembers this, but like there was a day when there were no CVEs. And so there would be bugs and vulnerabilities and things. And you're like, what are you talking about? Which thing? What is it? Wait, what is it? And it was impossible.
Well, we used to correlate like version numbers.
Yeah.
With an exploit. Like, I have this exploit code that I got from this shady website that you should have gone through the code to make sure there's nothing that was going to attack you inside that exploit code. And it would go, this is an exploit for XYZ software version whatever, and that's how we made the correlation. And like we at least myself, I'm sure many others would keep like folders like here's my like FTP some folder that I have all my FTP exploits in there that are for certain versions, right?
Exactly it was bananas for sure. And then I mean I did that for a long time, but
wait, go back to 2004.
Okay,
there was not as many Linux distributions as there are today. Red Hat being one of the most prominent ones, especially if you could get permission to use it in the enterprise in 2004, which back then was kind of hard.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I mean, so this is one of the things actually that I think was unique and it still holds true to a degree in security, is way back in the day, like, I don't think Ubuntu existed in 2004, but we would like work with Debian and SUSE, and I forget who the Slackware was around back then.
Yeah,
And
Ubuntu was just coming on the scene. I remember the moment I heard about Ubuntu, and the director of computer science IT department came in and said, "Hey, I learned about this new distro called Ubuntu," and he's like, "It's really awesome."
Yeah,
it was probably around 2004.
Yeah, somewhere around. I mean, you could imagine being at Red Hat, we weren't super excited about it.
Probably not.
Ubuntu's great. I have no complaints. And obviously they joined the club and got in on all the action and everything. But yeah, I mean, this was basically my life for 10 years, was just steeped in the, hot tea of vulnerabilities, of assigning them and understanding what's going on in this space, figuring out what is a vulnerability, what isn't a vulnerability. It was wild. We were making it up as we went way back.
Did you score the vulnerabilities, or how did the scoring work in your time there?
It's funny you should say that. So NVD,
did you arm wrestle? Did you arm wrestle for the?
No. So okay. So here's one of the.
If I may interject real quick.
Yes.
Before getting into the scoring, I'm kind of curious as to what was your criteria, which might relate to scoring, on what constituted a vulnerability or not. Forget the criticality, but what was sort of the litmus test for this is a vulnerability.
Yeah, I mean,
how do you score?
That was not well defined way back in the early 2000s. Like, what is or isn't? I mean, it's kind of defined now. I'd say it's still squishy. I'm actually arguing on Mastodon with Adam Showstack right now about this. But it's like literally before I showed up here.
Josh Marble was just talking about how he was fighting with people on the internet. What is with you guys and fighting with people on the internet?
It's what
you
I
gotta have a
for,
hobby,
Paul.
I guess.
I'm dead inside, so it's all I have. But I mean, so like way back in the day, in the early days, there's the proverbial trust boundary. Does this bug cross some trust boundary, whatever that is? And we would kind of make them up as we went. I mean, I think the most reasonable explanation we kind of ended up on eventually is Microsoft had a pros description of what like low, medium, high, and critical vulnerabilities were. And that's basically what we used for a long time, was just that. Because like CVSS didn't even exist. And it was hard. And there's always like, this is one of the things that not everyone realizes all the time, is there were many days where a bug would get reported. And when you're a company, especially a commercial organization, you have a vested interest in calling things not vulnerabilities, because vulnerabilities we have to fix, but bugs we don't. Or there's also that interest in how can we make this critical not critical? Like what hoops can we leap through to lower the severity on this? And like,
well, I think it speaks to my thoughts on incentives and how they're kind of backwards in a lot of cases. Right?
Exactly that.
But go back to that time though, before CVSS. I now that you say that, like that you said earlier that there was a time where CVSS didn't exist, and I feel like before that, if it had a CVE, it was fairly critical, right?
Generally,
like most of the stuff, like generally only the things that had, before we had a score for it, that were what we would deem as critical, got CVEs. Is that true?
I mean, that's pretty fair. I'd say a lot of the CVEs, well, and part of that as well was it was really, really hard to get a CVE back in those days. So we weren't giving it out to anything we didn't want to be a vulnerability. I mean,
there was no CNAs back then.
There, not really. It was, it was a little more much shaky than it is now.
There was a lot of CYA though.
Yeah, a lot.
But so fewer CNAs are CVE numbering authorities,
that's
where the entity has its own kind of bank of CVEs and can assign them to their discretion, right?
Yes. And they have control over what is or isn't a vulnerability in their ecosystem. And this is actually the Linux kernel right now is kind of making a brouhaha, because they're calling lots of things.
That was a great interview, by the way, because there's a person named Greg
KH.
Yeah. And Greg is the person largely the person, I mean, there's a team of people, but makes the decision. Is this a vulnerability in Linux kernel or not?
Yeah. And Greg does whatever Greg wants. So,
but Greg sounds awesome. You guys did a great interview with.
He's a great guy.
And he sounds awesome. And after the interview, I'm like, I trust Greg. Like I do.
He's been around forever. He's a super cool guy.
Greg said something that stuck with me from that interview, and he said, "Look, it's Linux kernel. It's free and open source. You can use it, or you cannot use it.
Haha, no.
So think of it that way. So if I assign a vulnerability or not, whether you would agree or disagree, you can use the Linux kernel or not. It doesn't matter. It's free and open source software.
That's
I
right.
like that freedom, and that just stuck
Right.
with me, which
Exactly.
led to how sometimes incentives are backwards. If it's not free and open source,
Yes.
then incentives get in the way of what's a vulnerability and how should it be scored.
Exactly. Okay, so I want to answer your question about
Yeah.
scoring, because this is actually incredibly interesting. So when we were at Red Hat, we started assigning, we just called them severities. It was low, medium, high, and critical. And we started doing that because NVD, the thing that collapsed in February,
Mhm.
NVD started assigning severities to things. And we of course thought they did a terrible job. And so Red Hat went to NVD. We were like, look, we hate your severities. How can we fix them with you? And they created a program where we would log into this terrible website and assign Red Hat severities to all of these IDs. That way we could basically counteract whatever NVD was doing at the time. So this was
I
like
think I remember that. I remember
Yeah.
relying on the Red Hat scoring more so than any. Now that you say that, when I would assess a vulnerability as a Unix admin or whatever back then, Linux admin, I would rely on the Red Hat score more so than anything else.
We tried really hard to not be weaselly. I mean, it was funny because we'd have meetings where it's like, how can we make this critical, not critical? And at the end of the day, it was usually, it's open source. There's nothing we can do. Like, it's critical. Let's deal with it. Which, I mean, being open source kept us honest more often than not, because there were many, many meetings that if we weren't open source, would not have ended the way they did, because it was all there.
But that's an amazing point right there, Josh, about which software you trust and what factors go into that trust level.
Sure.
And what you're saying is in open source, there's an argument to be made. At least one factor is because it's open, you got to do the right thing because it's open.
Yeah, that's right. We couldn't hide anything. And this is actually funny too, because this was back in the days when Microsoft hated open source, and Red Hat had a lot of vulnerabilities because we basically had to say every vulnerability is a vulnerability, right? Whereas someone like Microsoft, what they would do back in those days is they'd say, okay, there's a critical vulnerability in this function. We're going to audit this piece of code and fix all of the security issues we find, but we're only going to report that one critical, because obviously if we fix a bunch of lows, no one really cares, right? And there was this demo Steve Ballmer would do where he would fill his hands with red hot candies and talk about the vulnerabilities in open source using obviously Red Hat as his analogy of like, it's overflowing and we can't hold them all because there's too many. It was crazy days.
It's amazing to think about that. Linux comes with Windows now.
I know, right? I know.
That's just so weird.
I know. I mean, I'll never forget going to security conferences and like finding the Microsoft people just to pick fights with them, because like we hated each other so much. It's like, oh, you're from Red Hat, I'm from Microsoft. Like, let's do this.
Must consult someone else,
Oh man, I haven't heard that in a while. Yeah. So anyway, okay. So we've got this universe, right? We're assigning vulnerabilities, we're assigning severities, and it sort of felt like it made sense for a long time. And then I think in the last year, it's been growing for quite a while. And I think people paying attention might have noticed some weirdness starting to happen in the whole vulnerability world. But I think this year, 2024, and I just wrote a blog post about this, actually, I published a couple days ago, but I think there's a couple things happening that they're related, but it's like too much at once, right? You've got this enormous growth of CVE. If you look at the number of CVEs in 2024, we're almost double the CVEs from 2022 at this point in the year.
I want to stop there. I want to talk about that for a moment, Josh, because I think there's a lot of people speculating, and I don't necessarily think anyone's wrong. I think there's a lot of reasons why today in 2024, we are tracking with CVE more vulnerabilities than we have in the past. I think there's a host of, one, we have more software.
Right.
2, we're better at tracking it than we were
also,
before,
yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And we're better at finding vulnerabilities.
3, we're worse at writing code and software.
No, we've always been bad at that.
4, we're
always been bad at that. That could be a constant in our equation, Jeff. I would actually say we're better at writing more secure code than we were 20 years ago.
Because we follow CIS's memory safe languages.
Is the blog that you're referring to the one that's in our show notes?
I think so.
I think so.
No, I don't think so. It just came out Monday. I'll can I paste
I
Any
can
this?
case,
check real
Josh,
quick.
We'll get there.
what else do you believe is leading to there are more vulnerabilities being tracked in CVE today than ever before?
Right. Okay. So we've got just a bunch of growth, right? Which is all the things you just said. But there's also the Linux kernel is like 10% of the vulnerabilities so far in 2024. So like it's a non-trivial amount of vulnerabilities that Greg is adding. And like we'll ignore whether it's right or wrong. I don't want to get into that particular discussion
but
right
it's
now.
easier to get a CVE today than it is before, based on our
It
conversation
can be.
thus far, right?
So if you're a CNA, it's very easy. If you're not a CNA, it's still kind of a pain in the butt. And this is where Daniel Stenberg from Curl, he's got a bunch of blog posts where he just documented.
Did you
like
interview
this.
Daniel as well? You had
Yeah,
Daniel.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he was.
That's a great interview too. It's a great story. We talked about it, right? That whole. We don't have to rehash it, but it's indicative of the issues that we're dealing and facing today.
For sure. And I mean, the Curl's solution to all of his problems was to become a CNA. Which I think is indicative of a broken system, but that again, and kind of another point. But
I agree. I mean, I don't hate the idea, but I'm not in love with the idea of
it's expensive to be a CNA. It's hard work. Like there's a lot of things you have to do.
It's more work for the Daniels of the world, but open source projects, okay. But again, now you get CNAs that are commercial entities, and incentives get in the way.
That's right. Exactly. Okay.
So we still have more CVEs today.
That's right. Right. We got this huge growth, right? We'll say more software. And I think the more software part can't be understated, because I have a graph in the blog post. I just put in the chat for all of you to go look at. But I have this graph. I gave a talk at actually CypherCon like a couple months ago in Milwaukee. And I just showed off graphs of like open source. What does open source look like? And it's massive. It's ridiculously huge. Right now, there's this service called Ecosystems, ecosys.ms, whatever, make sense. But this guy, Andrew Nesbitt, he runs this service where he just kind of normalizes all this open source data. And then I pull it into Elasticsearch and do magic on it. And like right now, at the time of recording, there's over 100 million open source versions of software that have been released. And that's just the stuff he's tracking.
Does that include WordPress plugin vulnerabilities? Are those considered open source, or does it depend on the license of the plugin, whether or not you're including it in that data set?
I don't know if WordPress plugins are in his data set. I actually can't say that off the top of my head, but there are a lot of those.
So, this I think is important in the context of how many CVEs we're dealing with today, is that there was a post, and I'm pretty sure you probably read this one, that I have in my notes that I think linked to my presentation, that essentially looked at all the CNAs and the number of CVEs each CNA has issued. Yeah. And the top ones are really surprising. You would think probably like Microsoft, right? Might be the top. It's not. It's like VolDB and some of the, I forget the name of the companies, but there's the company that tracks the WordPress plugin vulnerabilities is number one. So I think that really skews the data. I'm not disputing that we have more CVEs to deal with today than we did before. I'm saying that when we analyze the data, Josh, some of it might be a little skewed because of WordPress plugin vulnerabilities.
Absolutely. It totally is. I remember Jeff is raising his hand. Yes, Jeff.
Yeah, that means I have a question. In the spirit of what you were
Jeff,
calling
we're
this
old
segment,
enough to remember what that meant. It's okay.
Thank you. Do you remember looking in the? Never mind. You're probably not old enough for that. Looking into the magic mirror, but the topic was teased as whose vulnerability is it anyway? When you have a vulnerability that's in code and thinking in terms of SBOMs, how much fighting is there going on how the vulnerability is reported? When it might be 3 or 4 or 5 layers deep in inherited code and platforms and building blocks that go towards an end, some end software. And is that part of the reason why there might be more vulnerabilities, is because it's reported several ways, several times throughout its life cycle?
I think that's a great point, Jeff, right? Like libwebp was an example where both Microsoft and Google issued CVEs for essentially the same bug because they had the same buggy library.
Right. In theory, they're not supposed to do that.
Right.
In theory.
I don't agree with that either. I don't think they should be able to do that, but
So
But they're both CNAs, so they can.
they can. That's right. So Jeff's question is the devil's in the details. And in if you use open source software, I'll pick on NPM, node packages, because they're notoriously guilty of this, is when you install one package, like that has dependencies, and those dependencies have dependencies, and you can end up with, like literally hundreds of layers of dependencies by installing one thing. And I have a demo application I use where I install, I think, 7 node packages, and you end up with like 350 things installed by the time it's done, just because it's like, dependencies all the way down. And now the way we track vulnerabilities today, you don't have like different CVEs in each layer. You have one CVE that ends up kind of percolating its way up to the top. And so in theory, that shouldn't happen where you have duplication. I mean, it does happen occasionally, but I don't think that is, from the data I have looked at, that is not a significant cause of it. I think what Paul mentioned with the WordPress plugins in VolDB, they're very, very relevant in this discussion because so like the WordPress plugins, they have obviously there's this company that basically reports vulnerabilities in WordPress plugins. WordFence is the name of the company. I just looked it up.
Thank you.
But they like, that's their business model. And then they use that to kind of be like, hey, we're like running bug bounty type things. Right. And then I assume they're selling the data to others. And then VolDB is like a bug bounty again. And so these are two organizations that have an incentive to publish more vulnerabilities versus someone like Microsoft has an incentive to publish less. Because when you're a vendor, every time you have a vulnerability, you're going to get inundated with questions and emails and things from your customers that are like, what do I do? How do I fix this? Where's the patch? What's going on? Versus when I'm a bug bounty or a security researcher, I want as many vulnerabilities attached to my name as I can have, because that shows how awesome I am.
Right.
And so, we've got
Patch Stack is the other one that of all the CNAs reported the most in 2023. And I did a little research into Patch Stack, and I think like what you said, they are the like kind of security advisories. Yeah, they're like a bug bounty for a curator of WordPress plugin vulnerabilities, and they're a CNA, and they report a ton of them.
Wadling has
also sometimes not very accurately, which is also concerning.
Josh, I just read your article, really good article, by the way. Anybody that manages to mention Vogon poetry in an article, you've got my vote. Anyway,
awesome.
I didn't get to that part.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert.
And 6 pinky swears later, but
I like
very good article. Here's the problem. I'm gonna generalize for a moment. There's too much software with too little documentation, too many vulnerabilities.
Yep.
And why the hell are we even scoring anything? Why the hell are we even documenting anything? There is always a bug. The only way that this works is if we somehow subsidize some public or nonprofit or NGO organization to give away, just like you said, sports ball figures, to give at least a baseline amount of information, and then somebody makes money enriching it. Okay.
Right.
That being said, and I agree with you, by the way, but the problem is somebody's supposed to do that. And CISA is doing, they're trying. I give them credit for trying, but there's so much that we're going to be behind the CVE debt curve for a very, very, very long time.
Yeah, it's very possible.
Well, I think we need to back up and talk about the roles that NIST and Mitre and CISA play in this. Josh, could you summarize? I could do a really bad job of
summarizing. Supposed to be playing, should be playing, are NIST, playing, are not playing.
Mitre and CISA all play a role in this vulnerability tracking and scoring game, if you will. What roles do they play?
Okay, this is going to sound weird because it is. So way back in the day, the Mitre Corporation, which is a gigantic defense contractor in the United States,
FFRDC.
They created the CVE program. This was in 1999, I think it was. Like we're long ago, and the Department of Homeland Security funded this. And like CISA didn't exist.
Well,
the
DHS didn't exist until 2001.
Oh, that's true. You're right.
Right.
Yeah.
So
thought
they
that-
didn't even exist at first.
So they weren't funded for the first couple years. But go on.
Okay. I think someone funded it. I don't remember who. We're
Right.
going a little back farther than I can remember now. But anyway, okay. So we have Mitre running the CVE program, okay? And it has always had some peculiarities, we'll say, in just how it's worked, because it's very government focused, right? And fundamentally, this was intended to be kind of a clearinghouse of vulnerabilities. Functionally, as a US government, was the intended audience, right? I mean, that's something to always keep in mind, is they're the ones funding this. They have their vested interest in this. So eventually NVD shows up. NVD is a national vulnerability database that is run by NIST. That showed up, I would bet, around 2005, 2006, give or take. And NIST created this thing, and it is completely separate from the CVE program, which was Mitre and funded by the DHS by that point.
Mhm.
And they don't exactly get along. And you have to also remember, back in this day, you had things like CERT, which would assign
Right.
identifiers to vulnerabilities.
Right.
You had a bunch of like weird databases that would assign weird identifiers to things. You had what, bug track IDs way back in the day.
Yeah. You
It
had
was-
VU notes were a thing
Yeah.
even before CVE.
That's right. That's right.
Mhm.
And so there was like, even then, CVE still hadn't become like the de facto standard. There were all these other things going on all the time.
Also,
And so-
quick trivia question without looking it up. Anyone know what the first CVE number was and what vulnerability it was?
1.
It's actually not 1.
No, I don't know, actually. That's a good
It's
question.
CVE 1999 0007 1999 0007. It was information from SSL encrypted sessions via PKCS 1
Interesting.
was the vulnerability. So you can go look it up on your own.
Why'd they start with 7?
God,
God only knows.
Who knows? I'm not going to ask.
right.
Anyway.
Continue.
And
Right.
Why 0007 and not 007? 'Cause
Right.
It sounds like they were
No.
looking.
Well, so
the
funny enough,
100.
back in the day, all CVEs had 4 numbers. You
Mhm.
had CVE. Well, it started out as CAN, where there were candidates
Yes,
that were
I remember
assigned,
that.
and then the CVE board would vote on every individual CVE ID and like turn it into a CVE because it was vetted. Right? Imagine doing that now, like 45,000
Quadling's shaking it. He's shaking his head because that
Yeah.
died fairly quickly because
It did not.
in their top hats and powdered wigs. I mean,
Right,
that's,
basically.
like
Right. Exactly. And yeah, that didn't last real long. And so you had this,
But
excuse
that's very government centric to have every number mean
me. Yes.
something. It wasn't
And-
simply sequential.
So there's still
It
that
was a social security number. It was a
right.
a PAN. It was a
And-
bank identifier.
That idea is still pervasive, that somehow these IDs are being vetted by someone. If
Mhm.
you're a CNA, you can just get all the CVEs you want and like no one's driving that bus, which is where some of these quality discussions come into play. But anyway, okay. So we've got our CVEs, right? We'll fast forward ourselves a little bit to now.
Are we glossing over when they had to adjust the numbers to make it bigger?
Oh, sorry. That's right. That's what I was talking about. Right.
Yeah,
They all had
I
4
felt like you were
IDs.
going there.
Okay, I was going, right.
Because I talked to Steve Christie, came on the show back whenever that happened to evangelize it because he's like, dude, this is going to impact people.
It was wild because it was, I mean, like think of a regular expression, right? You had CVE dash 4 digits for the year dash 4 digits for the ID. And they eventually surpassed 10,000 IDs.
Right.
And then they had to add a digit. And the conversations around the obvious answer was just to say digits, right? A number of digits after the year. And it took them way longer to come to that conclusion than one would hope, where it was very committee oriented, we'll say.
I will tell you that I was part of the discussion about serialization and canonicalization for software bill of materials.
Yeah.
And the idea of what is a software version was a 3-month process.
I believe it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't like it, but I understand why they did what they did.
Indeed. But we obviously reached the correct conclusion of that discussion, where now as CVE IDs are defined as CVE dash year dash some string of digits. And it can be arbitrarily long. Doesn't matter, right? We won't run out of integers.
version 4 versus CVE version 6. that type of thing.
Yeah, did they didn't
There weren't
they never
versions
numbered
back
them. Yeah,
then.
they weren't version. They never
No.
numbered them. Yeah, it's not like the
Are you trying to
CSF or
build
whatever.
CVE IPv6, man? Don't do that, all right?
We have that. They did that. There's CVE version 5 right now.
Yeah.
CVE version 6, right? Then we'll hold out for CVE version 8. But anyway,
Can you imagine a 32-bit version? 64-bit version.
Right. Oh, let's hope we don't get there. But
But
okay.
maybe we
So you've
should
got
plan ahead.
Mitre running CVE. We've
Mhm.
got NIST
Mhm.
running NVD, right? And that basically existed in a sort of steady state for a long time. All of the other identifiers and databases managed to fall away. Like CERT isn't really doing the things they used to do anymore. And so that basically just existed for a long time.
And they
And-
But the
sort
goal
of
was
played
that
together,
Mitre-
and they sort of didn't, because
Well, yeah, the way I understand
Yeah.
it is Mitre was responsible for CVE, and CVE would issue the tracking ID for
Right.
that, accompanying some metadata about it.
That's right.
NIST at NVD was responsible for enriching that, adding CPE and adding CVSS. Is that? I don't know if that's always been true, but-
CWEs.
and CWE.
Well, that's where they are now. It took some time to get there.
Time
But
to
yes,
get
that
there,
that's correct.
And by
And-
NIST, I mean also they would contract that out, correct?
That is right. They don't have people at NIST doing the work. They're paying a
Mhm.
contractor to assign these IDs.
And they just got a new one. Was that the news that I read?
Yes.
I don't want to jump ahead, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But okay. So and the groups like they communicated a bit, but there was like no formal agreement or communication back and forth, right? It was very just like there's some NIST people who go to Mitre meetings and some Mitre people go to NIST meetings and everyone's happy enough. And it was a very, I don't know, it's just weird the way the interactions work. And it should also be said that like when NVD started, all of the CVE information was basically prose text. There was no like JSON describing vulnerabilities. It was, you had a CVE ID and then you had a description that conformed to a certain, like there's a blank type of vulnerability in blank vendor product affecting versions, blah, blah, blah. And if you exploit the vulnerability, this is what happens. And they basically all followed that way they were described. And so you can imagine if you were any sort of vulnerability analyst, it wasn't the best time in the world to try to untangle what all this was.
It was no fields. It was just
text.
A giant text field.
Prose text, literally just text. And then, I mean, this is one of the things.
Poetry.
Right. Vogon poetry. That's right. But this is one of the things NVD started doing is they brought some sanity to that, where they were releasing data. I mean, it was XML way back in the day, but it had structure, right? So I could download their XML and I could parse it and I could do something with it. And they did their best to assign CPE IDs, which is CPE stands for Common Platform Enumeration. It is literally the worst possible way to describe product names and versions. But
okay, I thought it was just me, because when I started looking at that format, I was like,
no,
why is this so confusing?
Everyone
I don't
hates
understand.
it.
Yeah, okay.
NIST hates it. Like literally, no one likes CPEs, but we're stuck with them at the moment. So we do what we have to do.
Well, yeah, because how do you go change? You can't. Oh my god.
Well, and here's a dirty secret. Today in 2024, we do not have a nice way to identify software. There's things like pearls. There's things like there's a thing called Omnivore that exists. There's CPE identifiers. There's I can't remember. There's one other thing I think I'm escaping my mind, but like there's no good way to do it. And so like this is one of the challenges in publishing data like this is how do you identify what the software even is? And
can I expand on that?
Please.
Like when you say identify software, you mean what is this software's name? Who built it? What version is it?
Right.
What hot fixes are in it? How many people forked it and did things to it and then merged it back in? How many undid a hot fix, then redid a hot fix, then put it into a service pack and there.
But sometimes CPE gets it kind of right, where they're like, yeah, it's this software and it's also this software, because that's just the same software that has a different name.
Yeah.
Sometimes you see that in the CPE record.
Yeah, CPE does that a lot.
Bitch, because it's also the people that roll up software into bigger packages.
Right.
And so you've got 17 libraries, but it's all under, John Doe's ass package or whatever.
Exactly. Actually, Go look up the log4j, the log for
God.
shell CVE on NVD, and it lists all the CVEs, and it is like bananas. Because they put in like as much as they could find. And obviously the list should be probably 10 times bigger than it is, but it's a lot.
When did CVSS came about when NVD started curating the CVE data and making it exportable, downloadable in a format. I'm assuming sometime after that they introduced CVSS.
Yeah. NVD started before CVSS as far as I remember. And then like we're on CVSS 3 right now. 4?
Yeah.
3. 3.1, I think. Because 3.0 came out and had something wrong with it. So they released 3.1 almost immediately. But yeah, I mean, and we're, a couple generations into that. And
no,
NVD,
we're CVSS version 4.
Version 4 is out. Okay.
Yeah.
Is it out and official, or is it out for
I think it just came out.
review and normal?
Mandy's actually got a really good question. Go ahead, Mandy.
Oh, do I? Excellent. So
It better be.
It's a really good one.
I had a couple that came to mind, especially when Paul was asking about the rise in CVs overall. So do you have any input on like the correlation between bug bounty programs and actual CVEs, the number increasing?
Yes, I do actually. So Paul mentioned, you said Patch Stack and VolDB.
Yes.
Which if you remove, so I have I put all this data into Elasticsearch. I worked at Elastic for a couple of years. And so I anytime I see any data, I'm like, I should put that in Elasticsearch. And then I do. But if you take the CVE data and you take out specifically those two, and I would add the Linux kernel right now as a third, and you take them out and the graphs kind of collapse down into being a much more linear looking thing versus the kind of exponential growth we see today. So yeah, like those bug bounty type places are absolutely accounting for a huge amount of the growth we see. And I mean, the thing is though, and this is, I think about this a lot, like, should we make the argument that somehow they're doing a bad thing? But at the same time, like, there's probably vulnerabilities in all software, right? And I mentioned a little while ago, 100 million open source versions of software. Are there 100 million CVEs? Like, there might be. Who's looking? No one knows. And so I don't know. I go back and forth on this a lot to whether it's good or bad.
Well, related question. I'm sorry, Mandy, if I can, it's related to your first question, I think. Are you seeing more vulnerabilities of varying criticality levels? Are there more lows and mediums being published?
Jeff, I can barely hear you. Put your mic back by your mouth.
Sorry. Is this better?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Is part of the reason there's more vulnerabilities that they're more across the board, low, medium, highest criticals, or are there just that many more highs and criticals being discovered?
So the last time I looked at the data, and I've not done this in a couple months, but it was.
You could have prepped for the show.
I know, right? Right.
What are you doing?
I'm an amateur. Like, I
we
snuck
just
in
pause
through the back door.
and just come back a week later?
That's right. But so the last time I looked at that, there was the distribution of like lows to criticals, and this is using the NVD data. Well, the NVD data doesn't exist anymore, but it was not changing drastically over the years, where we were seeing similar distributions of lows and criticals, even though we have more IDs, which also leads me to believe that it's probably not the current growth isn't like we're just a bunch of garbage or a bunch of criticals, but rather it's just like natural growth of the system.
Gotcha. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Continue, Mandy.
Okay. I have a couple more questions then. So is there means whereby, especially bug bounty platforms like BugCrowd or others, that they could help fund government agencies that are taking over the NVD type enrichment?
I mean, the government has a lot of money.
Okay. I don't know if that was, well, if it was that there's not resources enough to keep the enrichment programs because of the scale and the number of vulnerabilities being identified. Just trying to think like
I'm not opposed to.
But I think what Manny's asking is what the hell happened recently where like shit got out of control and all of a sudden
Right.
NVD was like, we can't keep up. Like what?
Yeah.
What led?
Well, and
what
I feel
led
like
up to
bounty
that?
hunters and bounty programs in general, like there's a lot of them that would go, oh, hey, we did create this whole other ecosystem change now. And hey, we could do something here.
Yeah. No, yes. I think what you're describing is the correct answer, where there's no reason we need a third party to do a bunch of this work when we have, organizations that have a vested interest in this already. And so this is actually something, there's a new data set from Mitre, from CVE, called CVE version 5, which is a JSON format that they're putting all of the CVE information in. And it allows now the reporters of the vulnerabilities to add like exactly that kind of data. And you're seeing that in about 75% of the CVEs filed now are coming with like version information. They're coming with, now the severity is set by the vendor. So like you can argue whether that's good or bad, because obviously all the vendors want the severity low, all the bug bounties want the severity high. So like we'll argue that one back and forth. But regardless, the fact is like that information is starting to be put into the CVE data. And then the stuff that's missing now, CISA has started doing some of that, and then NVD is supposed to come back again. But again, we'll rewind the story a little bit and
CIS is
come
adding
forward to that.
Is CIS adding a CVSS and a CPE?
Yeah, in their vulnerable
And they're making
only,
that available in a feed now, right?
yeah, only if the reporter hasn't already added it.
Okay,
Which makes it very
Gotcha.
confusing, right?
But wait, why did explain there was an NVD feed
Yes.
of CVE data that
Yeah.
was enriched.
Yeah.
Why did they stop doing that?
Okay, so let's take our story. We'll wind it back now.
Yeah,
And
sorry, we're
we're gonna wind it back.
doing
Right, we've got
we're doing the
Wind
Quentin
back.
Tarantino
that's right.
style.
That's right.
editing.
This is right. Very Reservoir Dogs here.
Yeah.
Well, at the end, the editors can chop the podcast
That's right.
apart and put it in order.
And put it in chronological.
Get rid of all this fluff. Yeah.
Someone did
But-
that with Pulp Fiction, right? They edited the.
Oh, did they
chronological-
really?
Yeah. The
Did they
Superman
really?
exists.
I might be able to understand that.
I'm gonna have to
movie. I
watch
should-
that.
Yeah,
Mhm.
right. It's probably on the Pirate Bay somewhere, right? But
Mhm.
okay. So we've got CV and NVD kind of coexisting for a long time, and nothing particularly exciting happened, which I think is a problem in itself, because the CVE program and NVD basically were relatively stagnant for decades, like a long, long time, which is a problem that, again, we could discuss that some other time maybe. But we're going to fast forward to basically 2024. In 2024, in February, this feed of data NVD's providing, it just stopped. And I think it was February 12th. It just like
Yeah.
stopped, and no one knew what was going on. And
It was puzzling as hell. I will not lie.
Yeah,
That was
yeah.
really weird.
it just quit. It was so weird. Now, at the same time, there was like CVE had their CVE 5 data had just come out. So there was like all this, like there's things were starting to move around and happen. And it was like, oh, interesting things are going on. NVD dies. And then they say literally nothing for like 2 months. And then
The warning went up on their website too that they were
Yeah.
making changes
Right.
independent of
Right.
taking the feed down. There was that warning message. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And it sounds like, from what I gathered reading various things and talking to a bunch of people, NIST's budget got cut last year. And then obviously NVD took a hit from that. And they also, their contract they had with the organization doing this enrichment ran out. And then just due to shenanigans, they had a delay in signing up a new company to enrich the IDs, which, as far as we understand, there is a new company that's been signed up.
That happened like this week.
It was announced this week, yes. And we're told by the end of the year that
Shenanigans, aka government
government,
bureaucracy.
right? Red tape everywhere.
Uh-huh.
And so, but this is where everything feels like it just collapsed at the same time, right? Because you had this number of CVEs is growing at a ridiculous rate.
NVD walks back their feed.
Right. NVD disappears all of a sudden. And so like any vulnerability team doing this work is already under immense pressure. And all of a sudden NVD goes away. And the thing NVD was used for is they assigned CPEs, which CPEs are terrible and we hate them, but people use them because they were often a starting point for anyone doing vulnerability work to say,
We use them because
okay,
we had nothing else.
we have nothing else.
We have nothing
Literally,
else. Really.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So we would take those and often make them better. And then they would also assign severities, the CVSS scores. And the thing that makes it most interesting is things like FedRAMP. FedRAMP specifically discusses using the NVD severities to decide what to fix in your FedRAMP environment. So if there's no NVD severities, what happens now? Well, obviously you don't have to fix anything, but like, yeah, right?
Well,
There's no more
you're left
issues
with-
now. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Everything's fine. NVD fixed vulnerabilities.
One of the things I observed, Josh, and there are specific incidents that I included in my talk, was that the security researchers that found the vulnerability scored it using CVSS.
Yeah.
The vendor
Yeah.
of that software scored it using CVSS.
Right.
NVD scored it using CVSS.
That's
and
right.
you get 3 different scores.
Always. Yes.
And guess what? The
And you
incentives that
average
you
it.
alluded to earlier come into play. The
Right.
researchers want it high. The
Yep.
vendor wants it low. And
Yep.
NVD is usually somewhere in between.
They NVD did their own thing.
So
They
you
so-
throw
okay,
out the high,
so-
you throw out the low, and you average everything in the middle. Somebody does that somewhere for something.
Right. That would make sense. I mean, so look, I've given NVD a very hard time over the years for their terrible CVSS scores, but I'm also sympathetic to what they have to do because they don't know how a lot of the software is used. So they just assume the worst, which,
But Josh, on that point, and I think what you're implying is, because I know we've talked on the show numerous times, forget which episode, about how CVSS scores tend to all be like, 7.3 and above. I mean, there's some
Yeah.
sort of sweet spot for it. But when you were talking about sort of the origins and the history and the fact that, you used to argue whether something was a vulnerability or not, and you tended to only really, what I was hearing was, you conceded if it's a critical, it's a vulnerability. So there's sort of a legacy of, you're not really getting into this game until it's something high criticality anyway. So I heard that and I'm thinking, okay, so it kind of makes sense then that the CVSS scores are going to always levitate, average out to something that's higher, because that's sort of the history of this whole ecosystem thing, game, whatever we're calling it.
yeah, I agree. I think it's just, well, okay, maybe. I don't know. That's a really good question, actually. Because so here's the thing.
That's why they have me on this
historically-
show, to ask the stump.
It's good.
stumper
It's
question.
good though. I mean, historically, I think there was definitely, we'll say, a predisposition to higher severity things because we just
Mhm.
literally threw away the old stuff. But
Well,
no one was in charge. There was no CNA program. If
Mhm.
Red Hat said this isn't a vulnerability, like that was it. It wasn't a vulnerability. Like there was no step 2 to this process. And
You
so
have been judged.
right, exactly. I mean, seriously, yes, exactly that. And
Until
now
someone created an exploit, and then it was hard to argue
right,
that there was a vulnerability. And Metasploit played a critical role
yes,
in
Mhm.
keeping everyone in check, going, no.
Exactly.
You don't get to say it's not a vulnerability. You don't get to score it as a 3.0
right.
on the CVSS scale if it's remotely exploitable. And here's
but if the
proof.
when the remote exploit came along, that was CVSS version 2 before that was part of the scoring criteria? Or was that
Scoring has changed over time.
Yeah.
it has?
Yeah.
I mean, I know it was
Details
part of
of how-
3, but I mean, I remember when I was
two
at
fixed most of
Tenable,
that stuff.
I was comparing 2 and 3 because 3 came out in 14 or 15?
Yeah.
Maybe 16.
Yeah, CVSS 1 was pretty bad,
Mhm.
and it missed a lot of stuff like that. And actually, on that note, Paul, I'm going to just give a plug on Hacker History. HD Moore was I just
Great
published that
episode.
episode today.
Oh,
today.
no. He's done several podcasts. He did.
But he's talked a lot, but
Darknet Diaries is the one that I was thinking of.
yeah. But yeah, he did. I mean, yeah, he created Metasploit and 100%. Like Metasploit, I think, moved the needle a ton on how we categorize this stuff and what we call a vulnerability, because it was all the time, vendors would say, oh, that's not a vulnerability, because they just didn't want to deal with it. And then, yeah, Metasploit showed up and it was like, haha, suckers, it is a vulnerability now. And I mean, I remember this happened to us at Red Hat all the time. Tavis Ormandy, who was a security researcher at Google, he was notorious for this, where Like someone would report a bug, we'd be like, "Oh, that's impossible to exploit. Like that, we're not calling that a vulnerability." And then Tavis would show up like the next day and be like, "Oh, I can get root now with this bug." It's like, "Oh man, come on!"
I remember him.
It's Friday. Like,
Yep.
but yeah. I mean, and it was a different time, and I think that's part of it too, right? Is we exist now in a place where I think we're more willing to call things vulnerabilities maybe than we were in the past. And I think just there's this whole weird gamification of vulnerabilities now where you've got researchers and bug bounties want more. And I think vendors,
vendors are playing games that we haven't even talked about all the problems. And I do want to get to the solutions, before we wrap this segment. But
Paul, may I suggest as an editorial note that can be edited out, but I feel like this needs a part 2. Like,
yeah,
I feel like
because
there's a lot of ground we haven't covered, and we can take another hour on this, and maybe we need to have Josh come back
part 2. No, I agree. But if there's a vulnerability in software, it should get a CVE that corresponds to that version.
Yeah.
One thing I've observed is that vendors, not so much going, it's not a vulnerability, but going, well, we fixed that bug that is a vulnerability is in version 1.0, and we fixed that in version 1.1. Therefore, I'm not going to issue a CVE for the vulnerability in version 1.0 of the software because it's already fixed.
Yep.
And I'm like, but that means that you believe that all of your customers or everyone using your software has upgraded to the latest version. And there's no possible way that you can say that with any degree of certainty.
That's right.
I mean, barring circumstances where maybe the vendor has visibility depending on the system. But most of the time, all the time, you can't say that with a high degree of confidence. You may have some confidence that, well, I know most of my customers upgrade, but still doesn't matter. There should be a CVE because I want to know that version 1 has that when I come across it, that there's a CVE associated with it. That's the whole purpose of tracking vulnerabilities.
That's right. And I mean, this has been one of the challenges.
I think that's simplifying it, Paul. But let's
in certain circumstances, no, in certain, I have several examples where that has happened.
Paul probably has more, Jeff, because in the especially in the hardware type space where you're end of lifing things, the way it usually goes down is, I know like in router manufacturers, they'll say, "Oh, that product is end of lifed. We're not assigning any CVEs to that." Right. And then you can get around them as if they're their CNA, but it's not simple because you have to go to Mitre and beg and plead. And
God, we really need to do another hour on this.
It's so complicated though.
I haven't even got to ask my 1999 to 2006 questions yet. So
yeah,
it's a lot to unpack.
Yeah,
there is a lot to unpack, and
even more than unpack the past. But where are we going?
Yeah, how do we fix?
We haven't even gotten there yet. And I'm sorry, Jeff. I apologize for stepping on you.
That's okay. You do it all the time.
Put your mic back by your mouth.
I mean, from what I'm hearing from this conversation, vulnerability is, for a lot of the vendors in the software, people that are like hesitant or don't, for obvious reasons, they don't want to report a vulnerability. It has a lot to do with exploitation, the exploitability, which in theory is expressed in CVSS, at least version 3 and beyond.
Yeah.
But, where I came from in the DoD, vulnerability was simply defined as a weakness.
Right.
And weaknesses are bad, but I mean, there's so much to unpack here. I mean, we have an entire cybersecurity vendor industry that for the most part is built around vulnerabilities, the detection and the suppression and the remediation, the mitigation of vulnerabilities. I mean, things that we need to cover on our next session is, we've had conversations with, I don't know how many different guests talking about, pen testers and people that have, looked at real breach data, the percentage of breaches that are caused by known CVEs is like 3% or something like that. I'm making the number up, but it's relatively small.
Right. It's single digits. Yes.
So why do we keep talking about this? I was at Gartner Security and Risk Management Summit the last couple of days. I met this dear young man. He's like 27 years old, and he's got a startup company. He's a pen tester, and he's like, I'm new and I'm different. I'm trying to show companies what the real stuff, through pen testing. I'm showing what the real problems are that they need to fix. I've had conversations in the last couple of days with other vendors talking about the whole vulnerability prioritization thing, and everybody wants to know, if you're a consumer, if you're an organization, what do I need to do? What do I need to fix? What do I need to worry about? So it makes sense that exploitation is part of the equation, or the potential of exploitation. The exploitation exists in the wild, but there's so many other factors involved. There's, we've had conversations about, the over the last couple months on the show, with, what episode was it, Paul, where we were talking about, you had found a vulnerability and you reported it to the vendor and they just fixed it and didn't even issue a CVE.
Right.
And we had a whole conversation on that. And my
Not
question
all
was,
vulnerabilities get a CVE.
That's right.
Sometimes they're
but
fixed.
how many
not.
companies, how many organizations out there, their vulnerability management program focuses on, they're running a scanner, and if the scanner says they got a problem, then then it's the fire drill and they fix it. If it's not a CVE, is it even going into the scan engine?
No.
And is it even being reported? And so they don't even, they're fat, dumb, and happy, and they don't know that's a problem.
Scanners do step outside the CVE. I proved that in some research that I did years ago, for example. And I think, when you talk to folks from,
that was
like,
years
NIST
ago.
But if you talk to folks from NIST or Mitre, they're like, well, CWE, common weakness enumeration, was meant to solve some of these gaps in CVE. So it's not like a vulnerability in software that we can point at. A weak authentication, someone can guess the username and password, doesn't get a CVE. But go back to your breach data. How often does that play into it? And so there are facilities to track that. But oftentimes we don't connect all those dots.
And every one of my stories is breach related.
So and for what it's worth, Paul, a default username and password should definitely get a CVE according to the rules. But
default,
no one assigns.
I didn't say default. I said weak.
Oh, weak. Okay.
Yeah. But I agree with you on the default one. It should get a CVE.
I still want to get a bug bounty for weak passwords or default passwords, but nobody's going to issue that to me. And yet, how is everything exploited time and time again?
Okay, so I want to answer your question, Jeff, because this is part of the universe I live in right now. Is this whole, like, all these vulnerability findings? What do we do with them? How do I prioritize them? Right. And there's things now like the KEV, the known exploitable vulnerabilities list from, like, CISA, where they're basically creating a list of things they know are being attacked in the wild. Right. There's this thing called EPSS from FIRST, which is the exploit prediction scoring system, and that's trying to predict if something is going to be exploited. There's CVSS, which we can all agree basically doesn't work and is just a big pain in everyone's butt. And, like, we don't have a good answer for this today because we have all of these vulnerabilities and we know we can't fix them all. So we have to try to start figuring out, how do we decide what to fix? And there is no good answer.
Paul, book Sergey Bratis and Josh on the same show.
Oh, that'd be interesting.
That would be.
Josh, do you know Sergey?
I don't.
Oh, man.
He is Dartmouth. Is he Dartmouth? Dartmouth professor? Brilliant guy. And says that malware is getting so bad that they are creating a language of malware, just like we have a language of creation of software, like Fortran or Swift or whatever. Yeah. There is a language of malware such that they don't find a vulnerability and then write code to exploit it. They write code to exploit the vulnerabilities that will automatically be there because they can predict where they will show up.
Oh, man, that's amazing.
So that's why I think we should get the two of you together to talk. I really think this would be fascinating. I'm not actually joking. Like, it's funny, but there's, like, I'm serious.
It's funny because the alternative is to cry.
We centered this around known vulnerabilities with CVE, right? We kind of
Yeah.
touched on that. Yeah, there are things that don't get a CVE, and that's like a whole probably other hour discussion to run through.
Yeah.
Yep.
What is being exploited.
And then there's all the stuff that hasn't been discovered yet. Like Paul,
Correct.
when you and I were at Tenable, what came out? Bash. What was?
Oh
what
yeah, there was all kinds of stuff.
Heartbleed.
Mhm.
I mean, stuff that the Bash was particularly painful because when I was doing my pen testing back in the 90s, we prided ourselves on using Bash, and the vulnerability that was discovered in 2000. What
Was it
14,
Shell Shock?
15?
Was that Shell?
Yeah,
Shell
that's probably
Shock?
Shell
Yeah,
Shock.
Shell Shock.
It
yeah.
existed back in the
Right.
90s when I was
Yeah,
using
yeah.
it. And
We didn't know about it. Well, we didn't. Maybe someone else did, but
Well,
Probably
and
not.
that's the whole
probably
problem.
not, because we might have observed anyway.
Somehow
Where do you
need
want
to
to? Where
wrap
do you want
this
to end
up.
this? Yeah. Where
Somehow
do you
you
want
need
to
to
wrap
wrap
this up?
this and promise to get Josh back for part
Yeah,
2,
Sure.
I'll
3,
I'll
and
gladly
4.
come back anytime. Like this
Yeah,
is a
Josh
ton
and I
of
love
fun.
doing podcasts together.
Yeah, yeah.
It was good.
Josh,
It's
we
okay.
want you back. Not actually joking at all. Like, this is
No, for sure.
fascinating.
Literally
and we
anytime.
need to talk
Yeah.
about the future. We really have to.
Yeah, yeah, no, and,
Yeah.
and look, I think that's a good way to end this, right? Is kind of we've covered all this history about kind of how we got to where we are today, and it's fundamentally, we know that like we had the CV and NVD program kind of sort of almost working together for literally decades, and it was mostly unexciting. But I also think we didn't have a lot of people paying attention, and in 2024, just everything collapsed. It feels like, because everything collapsed, because it did. Right. And it's just because there was all this just pressure building under this system. And for whatever reason, it all just exploded all at once. And there's a ton of unknowns. There are not great answers for a lot of this stuff. And it's just completely bananas out there right now in what's going on. And I think fundamentally, the thing I will end on, and this is the thing for everyone to think about and thing we can talk about next time, is just the fact that, like, who is in charge? Right? When you're looking for someone to like stand up and say, like, we're going to work together and fix this, or here's what we want to do, like, this bus is there's no one in that seat, is what it feels like.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I agree. I think it's a good note to end on. Josh, thank you very much for coming on Paul Security Weekly.
Awesome. It's been an absolute treat.
Is this his first visit?
No, I
No.
think I asked you the 5 questions when you
That's
were on
right.
the last time. So
You did.
you're
You
absolved
did.
from your duties there.
Which
Yeah,
I still gave the best answer ever of Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen as my parents.
I love it. I love
Which-
it.
All right.
Josh, thank you again. With that,
Wait, Paul. He was on probably long ago enough that we didn't ask the favorite hacker movie question. So at least
what is
I
your
did-
favorite hacker?
Okay,
We did.
you did ask me that, but the
Oh, we
answer
did
is
that? Okay.
Hackers, which
The
is
answer
not
is
your
Hackers.
favorite hacker movie, if I recall correctly. 'cause I know, but whatever. Hackers.
Let's edit
is,
out.
it's so good.
Edit that
It's so
out.
good.
Edit that
No,
out.
it's too good. It's so good. Like, it's
Love
the
it.
best. Actually,
With
what's really
that-
cool is, so I'm gonna interrupt you, Paul. So a guy I used to work with at Red Hat named Matthew Garrett. He does a lot of like TPM work in the Linux kernel. He was at the EMF conference in the UK over the weekend, and they had like a screening of hackers, and someone handed him a card that says, "You wouldn't hack the planet," with like the IT crowd, you wouldn't steal a house or whatever. It was so good. It was
It's
amazing.
awesome.
It's such a good movie.
With that, we'll take a short break. Come back with the security news for this week. Stay tuned.